is what it's stolen from the internet, right? And so take a look at that. Also, the term innate, typically fixed pattern of behavior triggered by specific stimuli. A lot of the things you guys came up with. A complex behavioral response that is not learned, but is instead genetically programmed. Pretty common. Instincts are usually automatic and can include such things as migration, bird, blah, blah, blah. In psychology, I didn't ask it to give me three different. The question was, what's the scientific definition of instinct? In psychology, they're often seen fundamental drives. They can be contrasted with learned behaviors acquired through experience and environmental interaction. Examples of basic instinct, blah, blah. And take this, acquired through, which they can be contrasted with learned behaviors, which are acquired through experience, right? And that's interesting. Play a crucial role in helping organisms to respond to their environment and help them. And then I said, well, do humans have instincts? Yes, no doubt. Yes. And survival instincts, parental instincts, social instincts. I mean, you could read through the list, etc. But let me ask you something. If these are all instincts, is there any human behavior that's not an instinct? I mean, this pretty much covers it, right? This is your life laid out in front of you. These are the various behaviors you're going to show at one point or another in your life. I mean, what's left? TV watching, I guess. Yeah, Abner? Research. Oh, smarty. Yeah. So this is what our collective human thinking, at least in English, is about this kind of behavior. All right, we'll return to this in a bit, okay? But first, I gotta finish up chapter 9. Just one more slide, one more experiment. Oh, did I do that? And talk about one more experiment where it also turns out that activity. No, you're going to stay there because you're going to compete for the Kahoot with your group. Sorry, where they were looking at zebrafish, where they could watch myelination take place. There were several genetic tricks that let them do that, and in watching myelination take place, they noticed that during development, myelination is not just I'll myelinate you and now we're done. What they notice is axons that oligodendrocytes will send out will myelinate a nearby axon, and it will sometimes retract. Right? And what they also did is they used tetanus toxin to stop action potentials and axons, and they found that when that happened, that the axons ended up with smaller number of oligodendrocytes and smaller myelin sheaths. So that period after birth, when most myelination takes place, right, the vast majority of it takes place. In fact, it's not done until you're like 20 or something. During that time, activity in the nervous system is going to decide which axons get thicker synapses, thicker myelin sheaths than others. So I just want to summarize this about experience, the take-home message, which is in every modality we've looked at so far, you cannot have a modality that works unless early in development there is sensory experience in that modality, right? Nobody's figured out how to make an animal that has absolutely no touch sensation, but we saw that in adults, somatosensory regions are reorganizing all the time, right? And they get reorganized through activity. And I didn't give this overall message, but the somatosensory cortex, that homunculus, that map of the body on somatosensory cortex, probably that comes about through activity in the first place, right? And it's because, once again, all the parts of the body, neighboring parts of the body, are sending their action potentials up. And if they're coming together in one place, they're likely to take over the synapses there. And that's probably how the homunculus gets formed in the first place. Audition, I didn't talk about it a lot, but it turns out if animals aren't exposed to sounds early in life, they, if you wait too late for them to hear sounds, they're really bad at it. Or if you manipulate their exposure to sounds and you ask them later if they can localize a source of a sound, terrible at it. And we talked about, well, I did that actually. And in terms of vision, which is the most prominent for us, right? If you don't get visual experience early in life, you won't be able to see. And so the point I'm trying to make, I want to emphasize to you, is that right or wrong, a long time ago, natural selection made sensory experience during development mandatory for sensory systems to work. And I want you to think about that as we think about, would it ever be possible, or imagine what would happen. You grow an organism, you start with a zygote, you let it go through all those stages, and you make sure it never has a single sensory experience. Tell me, do you think that would be a normal brain? And would the organism, let's say you get it all the way to adulthood and you somehow found a way so it never had any sensory experience at all, none of the sensory systems have been reporting, and now you lift the ban and it's getting that sensory experience, probably it would be about as helpless with sound as it would be with vision. Okay? This will be important because if we want to talk about a behavior and we expect that it's independent of experience, that's going to get to be difficult. How would you test whether particular experience is important for a behavior, or in the converse, how would you test whether absence of experience lets the behavior appear normally? Okay, but for now, time for a Kahoot.
That's wrong, everyone.
Okay,
Yeah, just
questions?
encourage them. Or else this.
All right. All right, so I really like this. I really like this exercise because I think it's really good that it's good to try to think about it for yourself. And I think the crucial question is, how can you tell whether behavior is an instinct or not? What's the test you can do, right? Because if there's no test to let you know, then, you're out of luck. How would you know whether it's an instinct or not? And I will say, as we'll see in a moment, the term innate behavior, it's very interesting. I'll show you. In the 20th century, the idea of instincts became very unfashionable. And in the last 20, 25 years, it started to get replaced with the term innate behavior. But I've never heard anyone offer a distinction to how you can tell them apart. I think the fact that so many of you went to innate, I think that's because it's kind of in the zeitgeist now. I think it's kind of in the air, that idea, innate. Well, what does innate mean? Well, it means, comes from within. And then once you try to define it, you've got to deal with all the same issues you did with an instinct. So in fact, I don't think there's any difference between them at all. The first thing I want you to know is that the concept of instinct was not derived by scientists. It was brought up by theologians. So if you go back to ancient Greece, the Greeks and then the Romans following their path, for them the big distinction was that animals behaved according to passions, and for them only humans guided their behavior through what they called reason, right? And it won't be until Christianity takes over the West that suddenly there's a problem and you start seeing people wrestling with this question. Remember Descartes, who thought that animals were mere machines. right? And he thought that because he was quite convinced they do not have a soul. But if you watch animals much, you see they have pretty complex behavior. And if you've had a pet, there aren't very many human emotions that you haven't seen unfold in your pet, right? Jealousy, anger, hurt, fear, right? They're all there. Right? And so somehow animals are showing all these behaviors that look so much like human behavior, but they've got no soul, and therefore none of them can go to heaven. Although the good news is they don't get to go to hell either, right? And so it'll be Thomas Aquinas and his mentor who come up with this explanation for why it is that animals don't have souls. And then we get to Descartes, and he's just following, right? He comes after that, Aquinas. He follows that same idea. Oh, they're just machines. And okay, you might be a machine too, but somewhere in your brain, maybe the pineal gland, there's a soul that's actually in charge of what's going. So if you don't do the right thing, you could very well deserve to go to hell. And no matter how righteous and your dog is, it's not going to go to heaven. So first, I just need you to see that, and that idea, and Descartes then, he has to rely on dualism, right? That there's the mechanical brain, but then there's the spiritual, non-material soul, and they're interacting with each other. And that viewpoint is so firmly embedded in Western thought. So my favorite from Christian theology is, I think it's Paul the Evangelist, who at some point says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so there's also this idea that I want to do good, but if it weren't for my body making me do stuff I want to do instead of the stuff I ought to do, I wouldn't have any trouble going to heaven. And by the way, I just read a book review. There's a new book out just now about, deadly sins. And the subtitle is something like, can it be a sin if my biology wants me to do it? So we're still wrestling with this duality. But notice that within the neurosciences, right, you can't find very many neuroscientists who are dualists anymore. However complex your behavior is, however lofty your thoughts, these days we tend to think that it's a result of a material process, right? Transmitters and, ions and stuff like that, action potentials going on inside your head. So it's not easy to reconcile these. And the other thing that should have had people hesitate was once Darwin came up with his theory of natural selection, the most radical notion he was putting out there is that we evolved from these animals, and that not just physical traits evolved, that behaviors evolved too. Now, if you read on the Descent of Species, he uses the term instinct, but he's quite clear that for him, an instinct is any behavior that has evolved over time. He wasn't concerning himself about how the behavior comes to be, and he was looking only at adults. He didn't concern himself with how the behavior comes to be during ontogeny, in the process of growth, just that it evolved. And so it'll be in the 1920s when a Chinese graduate student at Berkeley, a guy named Kuo, issued a critique of the idea of instinct. Oh, let me show you a graph and we'll come back to it. So here is, in books in English, here's the origin of species, but you see there was a steady increase in the idea of instinct as things go on. And about 1920, Kuo publishes his critique of the idea of instinct. And interestingly, at the time, some people interpreted his critique to mean that he was a behaviorist, that he thinks everything's learned. But he would later, at the end of his career, he'd write a book where he made quite clear that's not what he meant at all. The main thrust of his critique was and he zeroed in on the pecking behavior of newly hatched chicks. In domestic chickens, as soon as the chick hatches, first it takes a little bit of time to dry out and learn how to walk and stuff, but from the very beginning, it will start pecking at seeds. And that was regarded as an instinct. And he pointed out that, and it was regarded as an instinct as in terms of it had nothing to do with experience. And he pointed out, and he did studies, he'd open up chick eggs late in this process, and he pointed out that, before the chick hatches, it's still having experiences. And he zeroed in on one experience that happened because the chick is curled up and its head is against its chest. As the heart beats, its head is throbbing up and down with each beat of the heart. That's going on in the days before it hatches. And even that each time that happens, the chick ends up swallowing a little bit of amniotic fluid. And he said, this didn't come out of nowhere, this pecking behavior. That there may have been things that happened to it in the egg that natural selection arranged, of course, that happened to it in the egg so that would show that sort of behavior. And so you can see there's this precipitate drop in the use of the term instinct for any animals at all. And long about this time, as the behaviorists in psychology come to the forefront, everyone's sure humans don't have instincts. They might have reflexes. Who was it? Was it Shreya that talked about it? They might have reflexes, right? The Lipinski reflex, or for that matter, the withdrawal reflex. Newborn baby, you pinch its hand, it's going to withdraw the hand, right? Nobody taught it that. But there were no instincts. And then in the 1950s, partly in response to what had happened in Germany, with this idea that certain races were superior to others and certain were inferior. And this idea that, the most important thing about your value as a person is what did you inherit from your ancestors, right? Which is what's at the heart of the sort of racism that was prominent at that time. Partly in response to that, two American psychologists offered additional critiques of the idea of instinct. One of them was Frank Beach, who was the one who pointed out, this is not a scientific concept. It was not generated by scientists. It was generated by theologians who needed to try to explain why you're going to go to heaven or hell, and you better do what they say, or else you're in big trouble. And who also pointed out these folks were totally aware of Quo's critique, of course. And he also pointed out that sometimes a behavior like when a moth prefers one kind of bush to lay its eggs, that might look like, well, why does it go to that bush and not this bush? Well, it must be an instinct. But then it turned out that the moth goes to whichever kind of bush it ate as a caterpillar. So in fact, it's not built in that's preferring bush A over bush B, bush type A, bush. Rather, if it grew up eating bush A, and here it is, ready to lay some eggs, then that must be a pretty good choice. i.e., it was very much dependent on experience early in life. And for Lehrman, Daniel Lehrman, he was talking, there were folks who were saying, if you raise an animal in isolation, all by itself, and it still shows the behavior, like say a gull chick that will still peck at what looks like a mother's bill to seek food, that if you raise the animal in isolation and it still shows the behavior, then that must be an instinct. And he pointed out that there's a practical problem here, right? When you say the animal will show this behavior even when raised in isolation, you have to decide what to isolate it from. And you can't isolate it from everything. And if you look at all the things you might isolate it from, it's almost infinite. And so you'd never be able to test whether the behavior's, I mean, you'd have to try every possible isolation before you'd say, oh, okay, it still shows up. So then it went down. And what's happened as soon as, notice this is innate behavior we're looking at. As soon as instinct was frowned upon, people started using innate behavior and almost never defining it. But basically it's like, well, if we can't say instinct, that's a naughty word. We're going to say innate behavior. But as far as I can see, it conveys the very same idea and is just as muddle-headed, just as vague as that. And so, and what's happening now is people, people who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. In this century, especially among neuroscientists, now the term innate behavior is popping up more and more often and is being left behind. And now people start talking about instinct again. Okay. Questions about that so far? Guess I could look at my note. Well, so sorry. So the first question is, many of you brought out the idea that it was unlearned, right? And so if you wanted to test to see if a behavior was unlearned, how could you do that? And I want to suggest to you that in the broadest sense, learning takes place when an organism is exposed to it, has an experience at one time, and by having that experience at that time, its behavior is altered in the future. That pretty much covers every learning, right? Classical conditioning, operant conditioning, language, whatever, right? It pretty much covers it all. And so how would you detect, and the way you operationalize it is you take two animals and you give one an experience and the other not, or you give one experience A and experience B, and then later you see if their behaviors are different. And if they had different experiences at that time point and they still behave the same later, then you can say that experience was not required for that behavior to show up. But to do those experiments, you have to decide what experience to manipulate and which experience to manipulate and which modality to manipulate. And how many possible experiential manipulations are there? Again, infinite. This would be a lousy PhD project, right? I'm going to test every possible experience there is. Or you could do an isolation experiment, right? Where you raise an animal and it never has any experiences. How would you do that? You'd turn off all the sensory systems and let it grow up. But when you turn the sensory systems on, that animal is not going to show you any behavior, much less instinctive behavior. Not only will potential instincts be gone, everything will be gone. And, yeah. And if you think I'm being too hard on this idea, so here are what I can glean as the four basic things that people talk about an instinct or an innate behavior, that there's a genetic component. Well, wait a minute. Can anyone think of a behavior that does not have a genetic component? How would that be possible? You got to have genes to build your nervous system in the first place. For any given behavior, there's probably an infinite number of genes, not infinite. There's probably thousands of genes that had to be working for that behavior to show up. Well, if every behavior is an instinct, why do you need the terms? Or they'll say, and this is one that really gets to me, and typically it's by people who aren't neuroscientists, and they'll say the behavior that the nervous system is organized to display. Or they'll say the circuitry to display the behavior is in the nervous system. Well, again, wait a minute. If the circuitry in the nervous system will not allow the behavior to be displayed, then you're never going to see the behavior. by definition, if the animal shows you the behavior, its nervous system must be wired to show that behavior.
Oh.
Or another thing is that it doesn't depend on experience, or they'll say it's unlearned. Well, there's probably no behavior that isn't dependent on experience because you can't make a nervous system without experience. Or it's a behavior that's unlearned. And again, how can you tell it? And here's the thing that bugs me the most about innate behavior, that term, or instinct now that we say, is it's almost never defined. So all those people out there are writing papers in Nature Neuroscience, talking about innate behaviors, and they never tell you what they mean by it. And that's a problem because, people have tallied up, there are at least 26 different definitions of innate behavior out there. And if people are using the term and thinking that their readers know what it means, it's always possible that the reader has, 20 different interpretations. This is not good science communication, right? Good, Justin.
What would be then a reflex rather than an instinct?
It's a great question. What would be, babies when they're born, if you pinch their hand, they're going to withdraw their arm. So we'll all agree that's a reflex. Is that an instinct?
I guess, what do you get your distinction on mostly reflex behavior? Then I would say, right?
Well, and does it arise through experience?
Yeah. Like not that specific experience, but some tactile experience.
Yeah. So are you sure that nothing happened prenatally with the baby? Now it's trapped and oversized inside the womb. It's getting plenty of tactile experience in there. Are you sure that tactile experience isn't necessary for the reflex circuit to get formed?
What about with cheeseburgers? If it's something that they...
Hold on. Let's stay with reflex for a moment because now you're getting more complicated. Okay. So, so are you saying that an instinct is a reflex and only a reflex? Are only reflexes instincts? What?
Yeah,
I do love making people uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that.
Well, okay. So why do you need two terms for the same thing?
Yep.
Well, yeah. And I think Laura, yeah.
I don't think about sexual instincts. That's not a
Sexual instinct. I know, but is the withdrawal reflex? Is it an instinct?
that.
Okay. No, I continue.
Reflex and then get to the
Okay. So some things can be both. Okay. And Abdur?
I just wanted to state there are different instincts to reflexes. The way I thought is the instincts that reflex is something that happened before you figure out how. So I thought something. It's a reflex.
Right. Your hand withdraws before you know you did something. Right.
Well, the instinct is like you mentioned the sexual instinct. I had understood. I think about it. I understood a thought.
Right.
And
I think you're getting at Justin's point that for us to call it an instinct, it needs to be a little more complicated than a withdrawal reflex, right? And here's something that I've never seen anyone say, but it would be if you disconnect the brain from the spinal cord and the body still shows the behavior, could it be an instinct? I mean, there's this notion that's got to be complicated enough that at least the brain was involved somewhere. And I got to tell you, the problem with not being conscious of what you did, right? If I, whatever behavior, I'll pick on whatever behavior Carlos shows me next, right? I don't know that he was conscious of that. And if I'm working with an animal, how on earth am I going to know whether the animal was or was not conscious of what it was doing? Oh,
Isn't there specific regions of the brain that kind of just direct the video?
Isn't there, say,
Regions of the brain that kind of light off one point. It's just
the specific reason that light up with consciousness? Yeah, all of them. I mean, no, there's not a specific region that shows up when people are conscious. There are different patterns of activation seen when people are in comas, for example, or asleep, and or daydreaming, right? There's a so-called default network that you're seeing, but it's a network. It's not one region. And here's, I got to pick on this particular example. So Scheller in Scientific American in 1984, I think in some ways they were kind of responsible for this rise in the idea of no, I guess not. I think they were responsible for it becoming trendy in neuroscience. So at least they defined it. And I can make fun of this paper because they're both very prominent. Axel won the Nobel Prize in medicine for olfactory studies not too long after this, or I don't know, late 90s, early 90s. Anyway, so I'm not going to be hurting his feelings because he doesn't care what I think. But here's the definition he gave, and I put the numbers in there. Innate behaviors are shaped by evolution and are inherited by successive generations. And that is a common theme in the various definitions of innate behaviors, largely unmodified by experience or learning. Oh, look at that wiggle room word, largely. How largely? How do you know when it's large enough of experience that it doesn't count? And they're displayed by all species of individuals of a species and not by other species. So, I mean, this is dopey on so many levels. I mean, it's just, let me pick the ways. Shaped by evolution and are inherited by successive generations. Well, every behavior is shaped by evolution, right? And if it isn't displayed by successive generations, then it isn't evolving. Or largely unmodified by experience or learning. Again, how can you tell whether it's never modified by experience? How many experiences are you going to try manipulating to see if it alters the behavior? It's displayed by all individuals of a species. Well, what if, so if only males show the behavior, does that mean it can't be an instinct? Because half the species never show it. And then here's the one that's like totally anti-evolution, and it's not shown by other species. Well, how could behaviors evolve over time if there aren't times when two different species split, they're geographically isolated, they become more and more different from each other, but they still show the same behavior because they inherited from a common ancestor? Well, does that mean as soon as two different species show that behavior, it's no longer innate? Anyway, so philosophers of science, they've suggested the whole idea is kind of a vague folk notion. And I think if I could wave my magic wand, I would say that innate behavior or instincts are behaviors that animals show even if they're never around any conspecifics. Because there are lots of very complicated behaviors out there. They're shown by animals who never had anybody teach them. And so, but as far as they know, no one uses that. So let's look at some examples. If I can get the computer to work. There's a wonderful book from the, late 50s, early 60s by Nico Tinbergen called Curious Naturalists. And it's really a great read about his early days studying animal behavior. And he talks about sand wasps, who the female sand wasp goes through a very particular sequence of events to eventually dig a burrow in the sand, capture a spider, paralyze it, stick it in the burrow, lay an egg on it, and then cover the burrow up. And she remembers where these various burrows are because she comes back every once in a while to put in a new paralyzed spider for its larvae to eat, right? And he points out that most sand wasp females, they will show this, and they have never met their mother. They could not possibly learn this from their mother, right? Because they never met their mother. They never saw their mother do this. So, or think of sea turtles hatching on a beach. They've never met their mother, and yet they know to go down to the sea. And so that does not, I don't know whether any experience is required for them to have this, show this behavior. I don't know that nothing about it is learned, but I do know that nobody taught them, right? And that's pretty cool. The natural selection arranged for their behavior to show up like that. Or think of all the fish and frogs and stuff like that who never meet their parents, and yet they manage to reproduce. They do all the things that tadpoles grow up to frogs to be do, et cetera, there. And so that brings us then to the great divide in my mind in terms of behavior complexity and brain complexity, and that is the animals that have parental care. Here's a graph where we're looking at their log scales, brain mass relative to body mass, and notice that mammals have the largest brain mass to body mass of any other group of vertebrates. Second behind them are the birds. And all the other vertebrates have smaller brains to body ratios. And this is not a coincidence, because these are the two groups of animals in which parental care is not just nice, it is required. Without parental care, they will not reproduce. The animals, the offspring will not survive. Or here's another way of looking at it, which is to look at brain growth. And we've seen something like this when we were comparing brain growth in humans and chimpanzees. But here we've expanded our view. And notice that there are some species in which the slope of this line is very steep for a long time. The animal goes from being this size to this size, and brain growth is still going rapidly. And for every species, there comes a point when the brain stops growing and the body keeps growing. And that's when this line takes a lower slope, right? And look at how these animals differ in this place, and compare them to chickens, which are precocial birds. They have parental care, but not very much, because a chick, when it's hatched, it already can walk around, it already can eat. The main thing mom does is try to lead it to some place to eat, etc. But compare it to fish, and they stop their rapid growth right away. And common carp never really have as rapid growth there. One more look, where we're keeping track here of when parental care ends in these species. And it turns out that when do mammal, that high rate of growth, when does it stop? About the time mom and dad stop putting so many calories and resources and predator protection in there. And so precocial birds, unlike songbirds and the like, they too kick out of this system and take a slower brain growth earlier than others. And by altricial birds, we mean birds like robins, songbirds, things like that, where the chicks are hatched and, they're totally helpless. They absolutely have to be fed by mom and dad or they're going to die. And so this parental care stuff, it isn't free. Why don't all animals show parental care, right? If they're all going to have bigger brains and more complex behaviors, well, because there's a cost to everything. And it's also part of that cost is you got to remember those two groups of vertebrates, mammals and birds, they're also homeotherms. They have to have a lot of calories just to keep their body temperature up. And that means if you're going to raise offspring and you got to give them enough food to keep their body temperature up and to get them to grow, there's it costs a lot, right? So cost of the growth, cost of provisioning, et cetera. There's some benefits, right? And including cultural benefits, but like everything else in life, there's a cost benefit analysis going on here. And sometimes it may not be worth it. Questions? Good.
As well, the trade also is the growth of the production outlets.
Which one?
Cost. See, I thought very helps the life long.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to make a big brain, it's going to take longer to get there, right? And so you've got to have a more protracted period of the animal requiring help from the parents.
Why would it animals evolve to be sexually active by appearing or the
Why would it evolve to what?
why would an organism evolve to be sexually active able to produce the border brain? Yeah.
Well, yeah. So you can imagine where that there might be some birds where, for some reason, the gonads are working now, and so they go out there on the market to reproduce. Well, except of course it is a market. There's competition, and if all the competing folks have bigger brains and more complex behavior, they're going to edge you out, right? Imagine a 10-year-old going into a singles bar, right? Even if his gonads are working, he's at a severe disadvantage. Yeah. Okay. So I don't think instinct and innate, I don't think they mean anything. I think sometimes they're code words for this is really important. Okay, then, we got a word for that. We say it's really important, right? Or that it's really, really biological. Well, yeah, but all behaviors are really, really biological. I mean, if an organism is showing it. Laura?
Yeah, I just, what do you mean by periodic stress?
What do I mean by what?
Periodic.
Periodic scarcity. Oh, well, anytime you've got to, think about birds, right? Where they've got to gather lots of food to shove into those nestlings. And for most of the Earth, food's only available certain times of the year, which is why those birds, they're only breeding here in the Northern Hemisphere when times are good. When times are hard, they stop breeding and they may even fly south, right? Because they're just not. So periodic food scarcity is a fact of life. And if you're trying to gather food, not just for yourself, but for your offspring too, that's a burden. So far, so good. Okay, into Brant. So I'm going to change gears a little bit because maybe we can get to a Kahoot. So it turns out that just because behaviors are influenced by genes, that doesn't mean that necessarily they're genetically determined. So if you look at inbred strains of mice, they are ones where 99.9% of the genes are exactly the same in every male in the strain. So-called C57 black 6 animals, for example, or albino strains, etc. Some albino strains. And if you compare the behaviors of the C57-6 blacks and albino mice, there are certain ways in which they are reliably different in their behavior. In behavior in the open field, for example, black 6 mice are more likely to wander into the center of an open field, whereas the albino mice are more likely to stay close to the walls, and things like that. And so, all the animals in that strain behave that way. And so you might be tempted to think that the reason they're different is because they have different genes, and they do. But in a cool experiment, someone took a bunch of C57 black 6 embryos and then implanted them either into a Baub female or a C6 B6 female, and you can use hormones to prepare the uteruses to accept the embryos. And then they let them grow up. And in half of the cases, they then cross-fostered to either a valve mom or a B6 mom. Got that? And then they let the animals grow up. They only looked at males for complicated reasons. And what they saw was that, first of all, that B6 embryos that were gestated in an albino and raised by an albino, they acted like valve animals in terms of, in this case, open field. Whereas, and apparently that had to do with mothering, because if they were gestated in a valve mouse but mothered by a B6 mouse, then they acted like B6s, etc. So there were some behaviors where it doesn't matter what genes you've got, it matters who raised you. And for all these behaviors, there are various cases like that. So it turns out that it's not just which genes you got, genes you inherited, but how you're using those genes, and experience can alter how you use them. And in one of my favorite examples of this, where they tracked this down, it turned out to be an epigenetic difference. So it turns out, if you look at a whole bunch of mouse dams or rat dams, that not all moms are alike, right? Normally, part of the maternal behavior is she will bring the pups into a nest and she will periodically clean them, including doing lots of licking around the anogenital region. And some moms do more of this than others. And people noticed that mice raised by a mom who didn't show much maternal behavior were more anxious when they grew up. And they wondered if that was because of that. And so they did cross-fostering experiments, etc. And they could also make a mom be poor at all that licking just by making her anosmic. It turns out if she doesn't smell the pups, she doesn't lick them as often. And it turns out that pups raised with little maternal behavior, in their brains, there's a methyl group added to the promoter region of the gene for the stress hormone receptor, glucocorticoid receptor. And when these animals grow up, they're not showing much of that receptor in the brain. And that means that they don't have as much negative feedback involved. So when they're exposed to stress, they have higher stress hormone levels than animals who are raised by a very maternal dam. So the same genes, but depending on whether you had an attentive mom or an inattentive mom, you may end up with different behavior that comes out. And what's kind of weird is that pups that grow up with a neglectful mom tend to be neglectful moms themselves. And pups that are raised by a mom that does lots of grooming, they tend to be high grooming too. So notice that this difference can be inherited across generations, and it's got nothing to do with the sequence of genes. It has to do with behavior that's self-perpetuating. Poor mothers give rise to poor mothers. Questions about that? Oh, and with high maternal licking, then the methyl groups aren't added. They're making more of the stress hormone receptor in the brain, which means it's more responsive to the stress hormones, and therefore it puts out less stress hormones and act less stressful, less anxious in a stressful situation.
On the last graph, did it show that as they were fighting the moon with pets and then raised by the albino, that they killed?
There were some cases, I forget. There are some cases where what mattered was, no, in this case, it looks like for these behaviors, there was no difference between whether they're raised by an albino or a B6. But for some behaviors, right, like this behavior, then these B6 animals raised by an albino and gestated an albino, they act like albinos, or the balbs, etc. So no, I don't know that they should. And I don't know that Balbs and B6s, I don't know that they differ in how much grooming they do with their pups, which would be the relevant thing to wonder about there. And yeah, questions. So this sort of change is referred to as an epigenetic change. And these days, an epigenetic manipulation is one in which there's a change that in the gene that is not a change in the sequence of nucleotides. So it doesn't change the sequence of amino acids and does not change the structure of the protein that's being encoded. But it's a change in the genes, as in adding methyl groups, for example, that alters the probability of expression. And there's several things that are known to work this way, both methylation of the DNA and acetylation of the DNA, all chemical changes to the molecule in front of or behind the structural gene itself. There's several things that are known to influence how likely it is that the gene will be expressed. And so I gotta decide. And the idea of epigenetic changes, it's very popular these days. So I think I'll stop here. I will finish these several slides in the lecture I'll record for Tuesday. And then when we meet again on Thursday, the next Tuesday, the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, the first thing we'll do is have a Kahoot over this material. Okay. And I'll get more lollipops, I promise. And you folks who got cheated, come remind me next time and I'll make up the loss.
Yeah.